All right, welcome back. This is Larry Wilmore, and you're listening to Black on the Air. Yeah, man, summer here in LA. It's getting hot. Hot, hot, hot. I like hot weather, though. I'm from California. I'd rather be too hot than too cold, but that's a conversation we can have for later. That would be a good debate, by the way. Would you rather be too hot or too cold? I would rather be too hot, but I understand why a lot of people would rather be too cold. I get that. Not me. So on the show today is Ben Shapiro, who's has a book out, The Right Side of History. Ben is kind of I guess you would call a controversial figure out there on the right. He's been called the voice of the conservative millennial movement. And one of my reasons for having Ben on, and I actually did his show too, is to just have more conversations with people who I think I would have fundamental disagreements with, and I think a lot of my listeners would have fundamental disagreements with. And not to have someone like that on the show to gotcha, fuck you, or have a real, one of those kind of conversations, because I think there's enough of that out there. But I wanted to have Ben on the show specifically to have a conversation and find out where he's coming from on some of these issues, especially the issues of our day, because I think these issues aren't going away. They're issues that are out there, and get to know him a little bit more and who he is, because I think he is one of those players right now who's going to have a long run, because there's a lot of young people who are kind of fans of his and that sort of thing. So we have a good conversation about a lot of stuff, from civil rights to abortion, equal rights. I mean, we cover a lot of stuff, so I hope you enjoy it. Okay, I don't have a lot. I don't have a big weigh in today. Let me just talk about Trump real quick, because Trump makes me so mad, you guys. He makes me so mad in ways that are just so fucked up. And then the things that he does just goes away so fast because there's so many distractions. But I wanted to point out the two things that he did that are quick outrages, so I can just move on. The first thing is Trump actually encouraged the country to boycott AT&T because he hates CNN. Guys, I have not been on the big impeach Trump train. I just think a lot of it is a waste of time or this. But what president tells the American people to boycott a company? I mean, and this doesn't get any coverage in the news. It gets very little. I mean, he tweets this thing. It's so wrong on so many different levels, and having to do with his treatment from the press. These are the things to me that are the reasons to get him out of office almost more than any of the other things. Believe me, there's a lot of things. There's almost every reason. There's not one reason why Trump shouldn't get out of office, right? These are the things that make me mad the most. I think because it's tied to journalism and the free press and some of these things. But the fact that this motherfucker has the audacity to tell us to boycott, like we're going to be on his side for this, it just blows my mind. It explodes my mind, I just get so fucking frustrated with this asshole when he says that thing. And then the other thing I wanted to say, and then he comes out and talks about space, and this thing called Space Force, which I still don't know what the fuck that is. I think it's this military thing. But one of the reasons that frustrates me is because I fucking love space, right? You guys know I was big into NASA when I was a kid. This year is the anniversary of the moon landing. My heart was beating outside my chest as a kid. I love space. I love space exploration. And I hate when he talks about space. First of all, because don't fuck with space with me. This sounds so ridiculous. Don't fuck up space. Please don't start liking space either. But of course, he fucks it up already by wanting to militarize that space. Excuse the pun, But I just want Trump to stop talking about space. Get Space Force out of your mouth. Get NASA out of your mouth. Just forget about it. Just let it go. These are one of those things I hold dear, you guys. There's only a few things. And I know a lot of people disagree with me with space exploration. I really don't care, because to me, it's one of those things that it's just different, And I would love it if we went to Mars and did all those things. I know it'll take time. I know it's expensive. I know there's a lot of stuff to do today. But to me, this is one of the reasons why I love Star Trek even as a kid, not because I was a nerdy Trekkie or that sort of thing, but it was the whole space thing, guys. I mean, it really is awesome. It really is. All right, that's enough of that. So the thing that happened in Washington that I was proud of this week was my old pal, Jon Stewart. And I don't know if you saw this, and I'll play a clip from this. This is the complete opposite of Trump, okay? And I know John's not a politician. He's not been elected. But when John is passionate about something, I mean, John has a power that I have seen in very few people. And he is electrifying when he's passionate about something. And the thing he's been passionate about from the beginning is the government treatment of the 9/11 responders in terms of providing the assistance for healthcare and all these things, families, everything. John has been a proponent of this for a while. He's had the people in his show. He had a very emotional thing in his show once where a guy was very sick and that sort of thing. And John gave such an electrifying speech to Congress. And it's the best of, Mr. Smith comes to Washington type of thing. It really is almost Frank Capra-esque in terms of the thing that gives you hope for the way we should care about the people that are in this country, and the thing that to me does make our country great, that the fact that someone like Jon Stewart can sit there and scold these people in the right way. And I only hope that something does happen. I hope it doesn't fall on deaf ears, but it's a very emotional speech. And I just wanted to mention it because if you hadn't heard it, I'll play a little bit of it, but please go to it because it's so emotional, guys. And it's just the kind of stuff that we need to hear. And I brought it up because I'm just proud of my old boss. I was proud to work for that guy, and I miss him a lot. So here's a clip of Jon Stewart.
They responded in 5 seconds. They did their jobs with courage, grace, tenacity, humility. 18 years later, do yours.
So there it is. So you could go online and listen to the whole thing, and it really is very powerful stuff. All right, guys, that's all I got. If you don't like my next guest, you don't have to listen, but I think you'll like this conversation, and I know I'll probably get some heat online. How could Larry talk to Ben Shapiro on this podcast? But it's okay. I understand. Whatever. But I think if you give it a fair shot, guys, listen to it. I think we had a good conversation. So we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. I'm pleased to have in the studio someone who's known as the voice of the conservative millennial movement, whatever that means.
All nine of us, yes.
I know, also the host of the Daily Wire, and he has a new book out that I'm very interested in called The Right Side of History, and it is Ben Shapiro. Hey, Ben, how you doing?
Thanks for having me, dude. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on Black and There. I told Ben I was on Ben's Sunday show. This is kind of a prisoner exchange.
That's right.
type of thing.
We had to leverage something out of this.
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
Between the right and the left. And as I mentioned before, I'm interested in having conversations, having more conversations on the show from people with different opinions. Ben and I disagree probably on a lot of policy stuff. But actually, we both hope to have good conversations about philosophy and about these issues and that type of thing.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's start with you, Ben, because you're an interesting person in this whole movement right now. I find you interesting partly because of your age and what you represent. There's kind of a youth movement, it feels like. But what is your story? Where are you from?
Well, I'm from Burbank, California. So
okay.
I've lived here my entire life. My mom was in Hollywood, actually. She did business
She works in
affairs.
Hollywood?
Oh, yeah. She did business affairs on a bunch of shows in the 80s. She did business affairs on Hell's Kitchen. So she'd been in Hollywood for a long time. My parents came out here originally. They're from Chicago, and then they went to Boston, and they came out here because my dad wanted to do film scoring.
Oh, wow.
And so
he's a musician.
Okay. Yeah, so he was a professional pianist. You know Michelli's? Here in
Absolutely.
studios. My dad played piano there for 20 years.
We used to go there years ago, like for birthdays and that type of
So
stuff.
if you went there on a Monday or Tuesday night, that's
the
my dad
Singing
behind
Raiders
it.
are probably
Exactly. So that's where my dad
Wow.
was playing for years. So
Michelli's.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a name from the past. Is
When-
it still there?
Oh yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So when I was growing up, I was violinist, so I used to come in there and play violin with my dad while he'd play the piano, and it was kind of a kick.
So were you like a precocious child? Did you play like violin like at 2? Like that
5.
type of thing?
5. Yeah.
That's
No,
exaggerating.
I was really good. I mean,
Really?
I got to the point where I
Because
was.
that takes some hand-eye coordination to do violin.
Yeah.
It's
a lot of practice.
Yeah.
So when I was 16, so I graduated high school at 16. I'd skipped a couple of grades. I skipped 3rd and I skipped 9th.
Right.
And when I graduated, I thought I was going to double major in genetic science and music because I was, a world-class violinist. I'd studied with one of the top 10 teachers in the country. I was pretty good. And there's still tape of me on YouTube playing Schindler's List when I was 11 at like the Israel Bonds banquet or something.
God.
And so that.
So you were like this prodigy coming up. So, and music was the thing that you felt was going to be a road. Is that what you thought?
Well, it's because my dad was a musician that I think that we thought it wasn't going to be a road.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. You saw. Well, I don't know if I want to work at Michelli's.
Right. Exactly.
Nothing against Michelli's, but
yeah,
right.
exactly. A starving musician is more common than exorbitantly wealthy musician. Everybody sees exorbitantly wealthy musician, then they don't see all the people working in Coffee Bean who have a dream, but
it's like
end up managing a coffee bean.
It's like that with most of showbiz, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'd been around showbiz long enough to realize that I at least had to have an alternative path. So when I went to college, I thought that I was going to, do science because I was very into that in high school.
Were you a science nerd growing up, that type of thing?
The truth is I was more of a history nerd, but I think in the late stages of high school, I got into biology and physics and thought that would be kind of a path. Then I took an engineering course an engineering math for engineers course at UCLA and quickly realized this was probably not the correct path.
Yeah.
So I ended up going to school at UCLA. I didn't apply anywhere else. It was the only school I applied to. And basically, I saw an editorial in the school newspaper that was comparing then the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, to Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi. And I got pissed, and I walked into the Daily Bruin.
Struck a chord with him.
Yeah, I walked into the Daily Bruin offices, and I asked if I could write a counter. That turned into me writing a point-counterpoint column for them for a while, and then just a normal kind of column. And when I was 17, I said to my dad, my stuff is okay. You think it's good enough to be in a real paper? And he said, yeah, probably. Why don't I check that out? So he came up with the name of something called Creator Syndicate, which was a syndicator. They syndicated everybody from Molly Ivins on the left to David Limbaugh on the right. And I just sent in my stuff cold. And they called me back 3 weeks later and offered me a syndicated column. So I went from not really being politically involved other than just kind of watching and reading a lot to writing a syndicated column on politics when I was 17 years old.
So it kind of came to you in some ways in this calling. You had no idea that you wanted to talk about things or speak about things. You were more interested in sciences and that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although my parents would probably argue. My dad figured that I was going to be. I was a talkative kid. He was figuring I was moving in that direction.
I wouldn't have known that.
I mean, my favorite movie growing up was 1776, the musical.
Oh, yeah, my son loved that movie, actually.
Yeah, it's terrific. And
I think he loved the music in it or something because he's very musical, too.
Yeah, it's really, it's underrated because Hamilton's so popular. 1776 gets underrated, but in one...
I don't know if Hamilton had anything to... It's been in the... 1776 was done in the 70s, I think, right?
Right, so it won Best Tony.
It kind of disappeared just for whatever reason.
Exactly.
Yeah. But you're right, it's not talked about that much.
Right. I mean, in terms of founding era musicals, because Hamilton is so enormous, people tend to forget that 1776 did serious business back in the day.
Yeah.
And but for years, for Halloween and Purim, which is sort of the Jewish Halloween in terms of dressing up.
I'm familiar with Purim.
Yeah, so I would dress up as John Adams every year when I was a kid.
Hilarious.
So I was always into American history.
Right.
I was more into the history than I would say contemporaneous politics. And then I have the syndicated column when I'm 17. There are some upsides and downsides to that. The upside.
How did you approach that as a 17-year-old? And this is something that you're writing, so you're not speaking yet. You're writing at this point. So where did you find your voice for what you wanted to write?
So this is what I was going to say. Part of the problem with starting to write when you're 17 is that you're searching for your voice. And
there are usually no writing prodigies because you have no experience by which to draw from.
Exactly. So exactly. So I was capable of writing really well. I was a very good writer, but I didn't know what angle I wanted to take. And when you're 17, you're sort of attracted to, okay, what can make a splash? What can get me attention? And so when I got into it, there was a lot of columns that were like, okay, what if I wrote like Ann Coulter? Because Ann Coulter was really the hot thing at the time, right? She was huge and had #1 New York Times bestsellers.
Right.
And then I really hadn't developed...
That's the conservative provocateur.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
And then, as I kind of aged out of that, and I think I developed as a writer and as a thinker, then it was like, okay, well, I don't really want to do that. That's not really my business, and it's not really what I'm good at. And so I started kind of becoming more of my own voice, which I think I try to be more considerate. One of the things that there's not a lot of room for in politics, but I hope that there will be more, is the process of sort of developing a thought over time. And it's one of the downsides of doing this
Formulating
stuff.
Something with a lot of trial and error and thinking it through.
Right, exactly. Like people ask me a lot, have you switched opinions on things? And yeah, I mean, I switched opinions on legalization of pot, for example.
Sure.
I switched opinions on same-sex marriage, although that was for kind of different reasons than everybody else has. But yeah, I mean, as evidence comes in, if you don't switch your opinion based on the evidence, then you're not really following the evidence.
I always say half the time I disagree with myself.
Yeah. And so that's why it's always kind of a bit of a sore subject for me when somebody will bring up a column I wrote when I'm 19 and they're like, okay, well, you wrote this when you're 19. It's like, right, I was 19. I said a lot of dumb stuff when I was 19. And so I've, created entire columns of lists of things I regret having said. So the good news is that you're forced to think about this stuff when you're young, which means you're developing earlier in terms of your thought process.
Right.
The bad side is you're doing that all publicly.
Yes.
So a lot of the dumb stuff that you say is forever.
Right.
And that's. I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, I deserve whatever criticism I get for crap that I wrote when I was 17.
Right.
As long as
Thank
people
God, things I said when I was 17, there was no structure for containing that. But let me ask you this: how did you know, or I don't know, how did you know is the right answer, but when you talked about Ann Coulter, who was certainly on the right, did you know at that time that you were a conservative? Did you put a label on it?
So I knew I was conservative.
Okay,
I mean, my parents were Reagan voters.
Okay, so you grew up in a conservative household,
yes.
Right? Now, was that conservatism, at least looking back on it now, or were you aware at the time? Do you think it came out? Were you in a very religious household?
Yeah, I mean, we became Orthodox when I was 11.
Okay, so you experienced not being Orthodox and became Orthodox.
Right.
Okay, so so someone had a conversion in your household, I'm assuming.
Well, I mean, you don't really convert inside Judaism because they were Jews before.
Well, I mean, seeing the light.
Becoming more Orthodox. Yeah, both my parents, we've
got to change something up.
Exactly.
What the conversation
they sort of made a decision that you have to choose how to raise your kids and how involved you want to be. And so
they did it as a strategy to have a more religious household because they had this.
And they were interested in it from the time that they were a lot younger. And so I think that, we became fully Orthodox when I was 11, but we were going to synagogue from the time I was a kid.
So do you think, was it a conservative household that came through religion, or do you think it just was conservative and religion just kind of added to that? I
think my parents both have sort of conservative sensibilities in the sense that they are big believers in the idea. It's not particularly conservative, I think, but it has become so. The work hard, and if you work hard and keep your head straight on, then you'll get ahead.
Like, in other words, your parents aren't really ideologues, but it expressed itself by voting for Reagan and that type of thing.
Yeah, right? I think that's right.
That
I mean, I believe my mom voted for Clinton in 92.
Sure.
My dad didn't. But, I would say that, being the Orthodox religious community votes 80-20 Republican, 75-25 Republican. So the Jewish community, it's always very weird because whenever you see stories,
lopsided a bit, right?
Right. So you see, it's precisely the reverse of the general Jewish community, which tends to vote 70-30 Democrat.
Yes.
But the Orthodox community, just like every other major, very religious group in America, tends to vote Republican for social issues, among other reasons, and also because they're in the Jewish community anyway, Israel's obviously a very big issue. And there's been a divergence in sort of terms of support of Israel over time between
Is there a schism between Orthodox Jewry and support for religion and I guess, would you say Reform Jewry?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they have very different views of the world.
Is that the biggest issue in terms of being conservative or liberal, do you think? Or is it something else? Is it more social issues?
Well, I think that partially it's social issues, partially it's religious freedom issues. Leave us alone so that we can do what we want, basically. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the Orthodox community, it's a biblically based community. Communities that consider themselves biblically based and take the Bible very, very seriously, like seriously enough that they take a full day off and don't use electricity and all that. They take the Bible very seriously, and that means that the provisions of the Bible with regard to social issues are taken. With a great
I'm very fascinated with some of these types of things. I mean, this is a little bit.
And I'm libertarian on these issues when it comes to government, but this is how people vote.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting to me. I don't know if fundamentalist Christians are much of adherent to the rules part, like the way that, let's say, Orthodox Jews are, because a lot of, I know, I'm not expert on the Torah, but I know that a lot of Judaism is guided by rules of living. Right. Is that fair?
Yeah, Judaism.
More so than philosophy of God's existence and that type
That's
of thing.
Right. I mean, the distinction that typically folks tend to make is sort of acts-based versus faith-based.
Yes.
Judaism is very acts-based.
Right.
It's like you get up in the morning, you wash your hands in a particular way, you pray 3 times a day.
Yes.
It's in some ways Islam is closer to Judaism that way.
Correct.
Than certain
Praying 5 times, that type of thing.
Exactly.
There are rituals associated. There's ritual cleansing in Orthodox.
Right. There's a lot of areas of life are guided by the mitzvot, by the commandments. And so that's.
I'm a Catholic, so there's a lot of rituals
in the
Catholic
it's closer to
Mass
Catholicism than Protestantism in some of those ways.
Yeah.
So I mean that sort of is the milieu in which I grew up. And then in terms of my own kind of personal conservatism, I have a very libertarian brand of conservatism. So I believe in a very strong social fabric. I think that people do need social institutions that they feel part of and that provide them a support network. Historically in the United States and elsewhere, that's been provided by churches and synagogues and
Sure.
religious communities. And so I think it's important for those things to thrive.
Yeah,
I think
you talk about this in your book.
Right.
some of these
I think
things.
the founding bargain was basically that the government would stay out of all of this specifically so that social fabric could be built. And so I'm very focused when it comes to divisions between religion and government. I never argue anything on a religious basis because there is no actual commonality of conversation. If I cite the Bible at somebody and they don't believe in the Bible, what have I accomplished?
Right.
Exactly. I have to make a good secular argument for why something should be so in order for that to be convincing. And so I don't make religious arguments on the basis of this stuff. And if there is no argument that can be made on a secular basis for a particular policy, even if I may agree with the social policy, then it ought not be in the purview of government.
Yeah, I think abortion is certainly one of those issues where it's tough to have a. Well, I personally don't think people are going to change their mind about abortion, which is one of those things. But there's religious arguments which sometimes have nothing to do with the law.
Right.
It's one of those things, so.
One of the things that bothers me about the abortion argument is that I think that there are a lot of folks. Well, there's some folks on the right who certainly cite the Bible when they talk about abortion. But I think there's a tendency on the part of a lot of folks on the left to act as though the pro-life movement is rooted in biblical feeling as opposed to in a belief about the inherent value of human life and when life begins. So I've never made an argument on the basis of citing Psalms. I've always made an argument on the basis of there is no hard point that you can draw between this is a life that is valuable and this is a life that is not valuable. Right. And so for the sake of preserving all life begins at conception, but biologically speaking, that is when life begins or an independent human life begins. And so that's the pro-life message from where I sit. It's always been a science-based secular argument, not an argument steeped in, quoting Leviticus or Deuteronomy. Or something.
Well, I would say that without getting into abortion, because we can certainly talk about that. But to me, when I look at the conservative movement, and I want to ask what your definition of conservative even is, but to me, what I think got in the way of maybe I'll call philosophical conservatism or conservatism more as a governing idea is the moral majority, and the moral majority's role in the Republican Party and the conflation of the way church and religion was used in terms inside of a party, and all that conflation, I think that happened. And I think a lot of that happened because religion as part of society, like even in the zeitgeist, started waning in terms of its use in the zeitgeist, I think. And so, politicians never had to prove they were a God person.
Right.
That became a new thing, as a proving thing. And I think the Republicans doubled down on that with the moral majority.
Well, I think
that's why God is at the center of a lot of those arguments, because people use that in their argument. I'm not saying that you have.
No, so I do think, again, there's a bit of an exaggeration that occurs with regard to the characterization of the pro-life movement as being inherently religious.
I'm talking about conservatism.
Right, but if you're talking about the sort of association of religious life with conservatism, American politics tends to be reactionary. The moral majority arose as a direct response to the liberalization of American culture in the 1960s and 70s, particularly around sexual issues, around the idea that there were distinctions that were natural and good between men and women, around the idea that—
Or that sex was more expressed freely in society.
Right. Or that, the old version was sex was something that was for married people. Right? I mean, that was the religious vision. And then it turned into, not only is that not the religious vision, that's a restrictive John Lithgow version of life from Footloose, where he's trying to make sure that the kids don't dance. And there's something inherently bad. There was a feeling on the right reacting to the hard left, the sort of Betty Friedan marriage is a Holocaust institution seeking to keep down women, is why you see the right reacting more to third wave feminism than, say, first wave feminism. Because third wave feminism is much more extreme. First wave feminism, the idea that women should vote, women should work, all for it. My wife's a doctor. My mom worked. My dad stayed home.
But keep in mind, but at the time, all the people on the right did oppose those things, So
well, not voting and not women working. I mean, I think that's a mistake.
But a lot of people, like the first wave feminism, was opposed by those arguments that were on the right. Feminism was ridiculed when it first came out.
Well, no, that's. I think we're talking second wave feminism. So first wave feminism, women in the workplace, that was basically. I mean, if you look at the statistics—
I'm talking about the feminist movement in the 70s.
Right. So the feminist. So this is why I'm distinguishing between the various waves of feminism. So first wave feminism is the 30s and the 40s. Second wave feminism starts in the 50s 60s and 70s are third wave feminism.
I would argue it's even before that, if you want to talk about, I mean, the suffragette movement, you could call first wave feminism. I mean, that was a movement led by women, as was the temperance movement.
Yes.
You know, which a lot of people don't realize. Prohibition was a movement started really in the early 19th century.
By religious women, by the way.
Absolutely. And many movements, including abolition, had religion attached to it.
For sure.
Know? But I'm just shouting out to women who have been at the center of movements. But,
no, 100%.
But women really led that temperance movement that led to prohibition. And women were also on the front lines. The first, that first wave of feminism happened in the early part of the 20th century in the textile industry, especially.
Right.
And the labor movement, a lot of that was represented by women. And women, women paid some heavy prices in those days.
100%. But I think that the notion that it was irreligious people solely who were pushing that is not really.
No, I think we tend to black and white things too much.
This is sort of my point.
Both you and I don't look at things. I think things are a little fuzzier than that.
Yeah,
it's hard to time machine it in today's divided world and to think that things were such divided. Like I even said on your show, I appeared on Ben's show, it's on the show, that both parties, even both political parties, were messier than in terms of including different points of view. You know, it's just in different times. Like there was a time the Republican Party was more progressive, and the Democrats kind of took that from them and used a lot of those policies that Republicans used in the New Deal. You know, and they became the more
Woodrow Wilson followed TR. I mean,
yeah,
Woodrow basicly just doubled down on TR. Woodrow's, by the way, the worst president in American history.
Well, and Al Smith, who was in New York, you know, who was part of Tammany Hall, saw these progressive things are a way to get more votes.
Right.
You know, and he was at the center of one of those first labor change movements and all that stuff.
Right, exactly.
You know,
there was a lot more crossover between the two parties.
Definitely.
For sure. But as far as the original question, which was sort of the moral majority at the heart of the Republican Party. So I think what happened is that there was
stick some religion back in there.
Well, no, it's not even that. I just think that, so I am not typically a fan of two things in religion. One is using religion as a club to beat other people. And two is ignoring the fact that religion does have inherently political sides to it. I mean, the Bible is not an apolitical document. So if you take the Bible seriously, that's
when you say that, what do you mean not an apolitical document? The
Bible has perspectives on a lot of issues.
But when you say political, are you saying political in a current sense, or are you saying political back when it was written?
I mean, in every sense. I mean, that when the Bible talks about certain prohibited practices, the biblical, the sort of the traditional view of that is that the Bible means what it says. When the Bible talks about respecting your father and mother, right? That has some ramifications for politics. I mean, if it didn't have continuing relevance, people wouldn't cite the Bible. I don't think that religion is made for only the private sphere. In other words, it has an impact on how people think. Now, I think the way we have to discuss with each other is in terms of not citing the Bible, but to say that folks who were members of, for example, the moral majority.
I'm trying to think of how your father and mother is a political statement.
Okay, so the way that it would be a political statement, for example, was so in the 1960s, there was a real feeling that the older generation had screwed Americans, and that those people and that their values needed to be overthrown.
Right, but that would be the extreme left position in terms of making that statement about overthrowing.
And the moral majority was reacting to that. In other words, what tends to happen.
But let's talk about the specific thing that was being talked about was the war in Vietnam and was the civil rights movement. But the
sexual revolution was also happening.
Sexual revolution,
right?
but the expression of that, you could extrapolate it to that. But that's not what was being fought on the ground. There were very specific issues that were being fought.
Right, and I think some of those issues, were correct, and some of those issues were wrong. Right. I think that there's been some good things that came out of the sexual revolution. There's been a lot of bad things that came out of the sexual revolution. I think that the war against the Vietnam War, I think that is more shaded than people like to make it out to be.
Right.
The civil rights movement obviously is an ultimate good. So that's.
But it wasn't at the time.
No, it wasn't at the time.
This is what I mean about time machining things too. At the time, it was opposed by. I mean, when you look at the tapes or the film footage of how people opposed it back in the day, and the whole wait, it's too soon, and we don't want to hurt people's feelings who are the ones that are in power. You know? And all those kind of language, it's fascinating to look at now because. Today it's easy for us to say, well, of course that was the right thing, but that wasn't the feeling at the time. And I believe that's the feeling for most movements. I think because humans ultimately don't like change.
Yeah, I think that's right. And human nature tends to kick in some of the worst possible ways, which is
especially if they're in power.
Especially if they're in power, but even if they're not in power, because people will use excuses to do virtually whatever they want, which is why, getting back to the respecting your parents thing, I mean, the thing about your parents is that they've been presumably through a lot of the same things. So you either learn from them or you learn not to do what they did. But
if you have bad parents,
right? So, I mean, not to take it too broad, but that's sort of one of the fundamental questions of American history right now: is did America have good parents or bad parents? So, I think one of the big political divides right now is the perspective on American history. So, I think that there's one side. And I think this is broadly describes the right, that says American history is a story of great victories being fought, not always being achieved, that basically the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence embody eternal, immutable, and good principles that were not always fulfilled, and that the fight of American history has been to extend those principles over a broader group of people. But the story of America is effectively a very good story. It's a story about a good people trying to become better over time. And then there is a countervailing point of view, and this isn't the entire left, it's part of the left. It's a subsection of the left that says American history is the story of racist, sexist, bigoted hierarchies imposing their views on others and using these supposed principles of the Declaration and the Constitution in order to make other people subservient. And so the entire system is inherently corrupt and sort of needs to be blown up, and we need to substitute a new version for that. And that, that goes to sort of how we view history generally. But I don't mean to press on the moral majority thing, except that I think that it's important to recognize how reactionary our politics are. So in
that I do agree with.
So in the 60s,
politics are ultimately reactionary,
and that's why I think you can pick almost any time in American history, and if you're living in it, it feels very polarized, and then you look back, that wasn't that polarized. But in the
part of that has to do with nostalgia itself.
Well, that too. But I think that the moral majority was a reaction to the Equal Rights Amendment, where people thought they were going to obliterate male and female bathrooms, which of course is now an issue. There was a fear that the law was going to demand.
God forbid we put in the Constitution that women are equal to men.
Well, no,
that's going to blow up everything.
Well, it was the consequences of putting that in. Meaning, how do you then determine if there's not 50% of firefighters who are male and 50% who are female?
No. A lot of these arguments that were made by even Phyllis Schlafly at the time were ridiculous because the Equal Rights Amendment was so simple. The language was very simple in it.
But the problem is that once you encode that, it's the ramification of the encoding of language.
It's the fact that there would be a problem with saying that women and men should be treated equally under the Constitution is ridiculous.
Well, I'll give you a perfect example of how the aspirational idea, an idea with which I agree, that does not necessarily play out legally the way that things you might want them to play out legally. So let's take, for example, the so-called wage gap. So how do you determine how much of the wage gap is due to sexism and how much of it is due to natural inclinations and differences between men and women? Right? Women take different jobs than men. They take less dangerous jobs than men. They work fewer hours than men on average. They want to take more time off from the workforce on average to take care of kids. They move in and out of the workforce at a different rate. When my wife had a baby, she was in medical school. She took off a year. I took off a week. Right? I mean, that was something she wanted to do. In fact, the gender gap is bigger in countries that are supposedly more progressive, like Norway and Sweden, because women have more choices. So if you have in the Constitution that men and women are to be treated exactly the same under the law, how do you – now somebody sues, and they say, okay, I'm being paid less than a man. Is the presumption that they're being treated with sexism, or is the presumption that there are differences between men and women? That's not clear
I would say that's why we have courts to decide these things, right? And also – a lot of people don't realize, how do you get to that point? Like, how do you get to the point of needing an Equal Rights Amendment? Like, a lot of people forget those types of things. Like, how do you get to the point of needing a civil rights legislation?
Well, but here's the point. We didn't need a civil rights. I mean, not necessarily. We didn't need an Equal Rights Amendment. Women are the majority of college students. Women in major cities, fresh out of college, are earning more than men, according to a Time magazine study from 2010. So it didn't happen. Women are not subservient in our society. Women have a better track economically than men do if they don't drop out of the workforce and have babies. So that amendment never happened. Women aren't under the heel. So this is one of those areas where the attempt to codify things in government may not actually be necessary, even if, again, and because I agree that women should be paid the same for the same work.
Because of the resilience of women, it doesn't mean that there should be a constitutional language that expresses this when there was explicit language supporting men, and especially white men, as we know, in those days where it didn't have women. And the wanting to be included in that
Well, I mean, all men are created equal was never intended to mean just men. I mean,
of course it did.
So this is a fundamental, question as to whether you think that principle was meant to include all people, or whether that was meant to include a particular subset.
Well, of course it did. At the time, when that kind of language was used, this is not necessarily disagree with you personally, but men was thought to be white men, men who could even make this type of language happen. Anybody else didn't quite qualify under this category of what was called men. There's another use of men that, of course, means mankind and humans and that type of thing. But I think the language in the Constitution specifically talks about people who are meant to participate in this fully.
Okay, and then
is that fair?
So I think that is fair in the sense that there was a constitutional amendment to allow women to vote, for example.
Right,
sure.
but in terms of all men are created equal, people knew at that time that did not include all men. That included the white men and that society who it was known that they were allowed to participate.
So
in it. If we're being fair about those times,
so half agree, half disagree. So I agree that the political application of that phrase "all men are created equal" applied only to a subset of human beings.
Right.
Yes, that is true.
Yes, the philosophical part of it.
So the philosophical, but it's the philosophical part that was eventually extended and used by. I mean, this is why Frederick Douglass gives this very famous speech, right, where he specifically talks about why the Constitution is his document too.
That's right.
And he's never been given a fair share of it.
That's
right?
correct.
And that's a convincing, good, useful argument, right? And that's the kind of argument that brings people around.
Yes.
So
it's like you use these words. Now these words are going to come back to haunt you.
And that's the difference between. I mean, that's really why they build monuments to MLK, right? I mean, because MLK was doing the same thing. He was saying, "You made this promise, and then you lied, right? The promise was never fulfilled."
The promissory note, yes,
right, exactly. And now we're here to collect, right? And that was correct. And that is an appeal that I think brings people
now where
around.
America does get credit, you're right. Because that language was used, that language was also used to progress movements and that sort of thing.
And on a broad philosophical level, I think that everybody likes to talk about Jefferson because he's obviously the most racist of the founders who were involved in writing these documents. I mean,
I don't make a distinction between who's the most racist.
Well, I mean, but there is an actual distinction between like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, right? I mean, John Adams was militantly anti-slavery, for example. Right? There were founders who were militantly anti-slavery, which is why the Constitution phased out the importation of slaves past 1807.
Jefferson was a Southerner.
Right.
Right.
And Jefferson is a really conflicted character because early in his career he's talking about the evils of slavery, and then he sort of gets acclimated to being real rich and owning other folks, and and he sort of learns to live with the dichotomy, obviously,
as most people did back then.
Right, or at least most people in the South. I mean, this was a serious issue even in the time of the Declaration. I mean, there was an original provision condemning the British Empire for bringing slaves to the United States that was ripped out by the South because the South didn't want that stuff in there.
There was a lot of hypocrisy for a long time about slavery and what to do with it because getting rid of slavery presents a lot of problems of treating blacks as equal human beings.
Right.
That is the biggest threat, to the end of slavery, especially at that time.
Well, especially because I mean, what does that mean for folks who have, I mean, you've kidnapped an entire people and brought them to your shores. Yeah. They now constitute the majority of your population. Which they did. I mean, by the time slavery ended in a lot of these states, slaves represented either the bulk minority or an actual majority of people in these places. It's pretty easy to then devalue folks in order to maintain a certain level of power. But
also, a lot of that is kind of misunderstood, I think, Ben, in terms of history. Like a lot of people associate racism directly with slavery, or the subsetting, let's say, of blacks or people that aren't necessarily white in a certain way tied to slavery. And that's not true.
No, of course it was disconnected. There's racism in the North, too.
It's the same thing with anti-Semitism. It didn't require these other events for it to exist.
Right.
Especially in Europe.
No, although
that's something that's been around for a long time.
It's true, although it was formalized in a different way in slavery than it had been previously, obviously.
Absolutely. So. And that just... slavery did a lot to really fuel those fires and to make people even more, it kind of more physically pointed out the you're this and we're this type of thing. Where when you're living with people, that gets a little fuzzy. You can still have those opinions, but the more you live with people, you understand that we're basically not that much different. There are cultural differences because people have different cultures and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, although I think that in order for that to really take hold, you do need to have a common vision of a good. because what the studies tend to show is that racial diversity doesn't necessarily lead to people actually liking each other more unless they are also oriented towards something in common. So if you go into the Army, for example, people are oriented in common. And so people tend to, you've dealt with people in the military. I've dealt with people in the military.
Sports is one of those types of things.
Sports is one of those things. Church is obviously one of those things.
Church is a good thing for that.
Yeah.
People with similar things.
Right. Yeah. This is what the author of Bowling Alone, I'm trying to, his name slips my mind, Robert Putnam over at Harvard talks about. He has this funny line. He's on the political left, and he has this funny line where he says he was writing a book basically about how diversity is our strength, and he did the research, and what he actually found was that he said only two things go up inevitably with the emergence of diversity in a census tract. Only two things: TV watching and protest marches. Right. Unless,
it's such a dismissal of. Once again, I go back to the whole reason for diversity. And one of the biggest pushes for diversity, a lot of things start black and white, by the way, and then it's extrapolated out to other things and takes on a different meaning.
Right.
But the whole reason for diversity is because blacks were shut out of society.
100%.
In other words, we weren't allowed to participate. This was written into law. And so when I'm a black person and I talk and I'm speaking about diversity, there's a reason for that.
Because you want to exist in the common space.
Correct.
Yes, of course.
And when people shut that down and say diversity is not important, say, motherfucker, this is
right, no, that's it.
Motherfucker, you don't know why we're even talking about this thing.
No, so
to shut it down as an idea through studies, it's like, what are you talking about studies? That's when I say, like, you're a researcher, I'm a witness. You know?
But his
like I
think
experienced these things of being shut out. What diversity has a different meaning to me.
And but his conclusion
than that
is
academic meaning of. These are different types put together, and they don't have things in common, and that sort of thing.
So I agree, but the conclusion that he comes to is that if you don't share anything in common, diversity is a bad thing. If you do share something in common, diversity is a wonderful thing, because then we have different experiences, we learn from each other, we treat each other better because we know each other.
That is a cold study of it, but I'm saying one of the root causes of needing diversity is in that mix, and a lot of it, you talk about tribalism a little bit in your book, too. A part of what tribalism is, if you look at it coldly, is that there is something we're doing together that is better than what they're doing.
Right.
And we need to keep this thing good, for whatever reason, and don't let them take our shit or change our shit or that type of thing. And this is why I have a problem with just even the phrase identity politics now. Because for the longest time, identity politics was white Americans.
That's true.
But nobody calls that identity politics, And now I know that they call it that because people have to call it,
that's the parlance now.
Yeah, you have to make a term for them. So
the point that I'm making, though, is that this is why if we want to come to, the kind of diversity that's good for the country, and what I mean by that is a diversity where we're not tearing away at each other and identifying as tribal groups, either on the basis of race or anything else, we need to have some ideas in common. Things that we share, and I think that those
or at
ideas,
least goals, yes,
goals would be good, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be something there, and that's why, I think that the kind of politicization of all of our common spaces is very dangerous. I think that the attempt to turn everything into a political issue is incredibly dangerous.
With you on that.
I think that we do actually still have to have certain fundamental values in common, like the idea that I can make a reasonable argument to you without appealing to my tribe, right? So this is one thing that I'm involved with the so-called intellectual dark web,
or that I need to be threatened by your tribe if you did.
Right, exactly. Like if
that's the flip side.
Right. If we disagree, there shouldn't be threats emanating from one tribe.
Like if I'm speaking from my point of view as a Black American, why does someone need to be threatened by that, or think that it's less American because of my particular experience?
Right.
Those types of things is the other part of that.
In order for there to be diversity that is both wonderful and good for the people who are involved in the diversity, you do need the bigger tribe has to be the country, right? Or at least some idea of what the country is, because otherwise you are going to break down inevitably. People have social connections. They're going to break down into tribes almost no matter what. The idea of the United States, I think that is the best idea, and this is what I think conservatism really is limited government that allows for you to associate with people you want to associate with, but we have these broader things we can come together on, and that creates this creedal tribe. And that's why I say, the idea of the Declaration of Independence, which is that it was not always fulfilled, that's still the idea that we should be invoking. So when I talk in my book about,
Let's talk about your book.
Yeah. No, and I don't mean to sell my book, but
that's okay. The right side of history.
But when I talk in the book about sort of the idea that we used to see each other as brothers and sisters, a lot of people came down and they're like, what are you talking about? Like, look at American history. That's not true. And of course, they're right? I mean, the fact is that in the 60s, we weren't exactly seeing each other as brothers and sisters. The point I was trying to make is that the values that were constantly invoked were those values, meaning that what MLK tries to invoke is that, right? He's invoking, you may not think you're my brother, you are my brother. And so as my brother, you can't treat me like this.
Right.
And it's those values, and now what I see is people not invoking those common values anymore and retreating back into, and this is right, left, many different races.
Sure. Well, I will make a slight detour again because once again, I have to go to the arguments that were being used against him. Okay, some were based on these same values.
I mean, that is true, but the success of MLK is based on the success of MLK. Meaning,
he was assassinated too.
That's true, and
right.
and now we all take a federal holiday off for his birthday. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that this stuff wasn't controversial at the time.
Right.
What I'm saying is that the unifying message of America, and this has been true for every successful movement in the history of the country, has been the argument that we're all brothers and you're not treating me like a brother. And now what I'm starting to see is we're not brothers. You're an asshole. And I'm going to treat you like you're an asshole. And that's dangerous stuff. And it's why you're getting, I think, an increasing oscillation in politics. I think the reactionary nature of politics is getting worse. So to take that example, you get the Equal Rights Amendment, the moral majority comes up. People on the left react to the moral majority by saying, you guys are a bunch of theocrats, so we need to basically crack down on the practice of religion in the public square, which religious people say, well, hold up a second.
I don't think I just have to stop you. I think those are separate events. I think the support for the Equal Rights Amendment had nothing to do with the kind of the collapse of religion in the public square. No. I'm talking about the actual group called the Moral Majority. The Moral Majority did arise. The Falwell Moral Majority did arise as a direct response to the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, that as a broader historical matter, obviously that was building for a while thanks to the sexual revolution of the 60s and a feeling that, you're right, religion was being ejected from the public square. People were going to church less. It was becoming a less religious country. And so they were saying, okay, well, we're still here, guys, and we want to be involved. But also they wanted to put it into politics.
But I think what they were saying is that it was always in politics and you're ejecting us.
No, it was always in – I'm saying it was always in culture, that it didn't have to be in politics is what I'm saying.
Right, but
like different –
is that true? I mean –
oh, completely. If you look back even at the popular culture, because I know you've talked about this in books and that sort of thing. If you look at popular culture, it was okay to have stories that had people going to church. You know, one of my favorite movies is The Bishop's Wife, this Christmas movie,
great movie.
It's a story about a bishop of a church and everything, and it's not that big a deal, but it's harder to have, we don't share that in our popular culture as much anymore, or as a society in the way that it was a given back then, that God and church and country were things that people they didn't have to put extra on it, is what I'm saying.
Right. No,
because it was kind of a given in society, is all I'm saying. You know? Like most people, it was a ritual of going to church on Sunday, if you're Jewish, going to temple on Saturday, whatever it was, as this country ritual. But you're correct about that started falling apart, especially in the 60s, in terms of it being let's say a country institution, something that we all agreed upon as something. And
you're right that the culture was broadly in line with these sort of traditional Judeo-Christian values. And then I think,
and I'm just using the pop culture as an example, but it's not just pop culture.
Of course, and I think that what happened, but here's sort of my view of politics, is that the law is made as a result of people's cultural convictions very often. And so as the culture changed, the law changed. And when the law changed, there were a bunch of people who suddenly awakened to the idea that they have to get involved in politics, because when the law changes, the law is a political thing. So to take an example, people were becoming more socially liberal on a variety of issues in the 1960s. Roe v. Wade hits, and suddenly abortion is the law of the land across the country. And a bunch of Christians go, okay, this isn't just a question of less people are going to church now. This is a question of what's embedded in law. If we don't get involved in the public square, we're going to be forcibly ejected
there are different
from the public
things
square.
that motivate people to get involved in.
And I think that if you talk to religious folks,
and that start movements,
and I'll tell you right now, I mean that is what is getting religious people so involved in politics now. I mean, right now,
because they feel the law is infringing upon their religious beliefs.
Right, that's right. I mean, to take a perfect example, so there's this woman up in Washington State. Right? She runs a bakery or a flower shop, Arlene's Flowers, and a gay couple comes in. And she's been catering to this gay guy for years. I mean, he's a friend. He's come in. She's sold him flowers for years. He says, I want you to specifically make these floral arrangements for my same-sex wedding. And she says, I'm a religious Christian. I'm sorry, I can't do that. Here's the name of 3 other florists. And he says, okay. Then he proceeds to go with the ACLU to the board in the state of Washington and sue her and basically put her out of business. So I understand folks on the left are saying, okay, well, look at all these religious bigots who won't serve this gay guy. Well, she was serving the gay guy, number one. But number two, for the religious person, you're now saying that you get to dictate to them how they live their life in a business setting. For me, so as a religious person, a lot of religious people see this as a specific assault on freedom of religion.
Do you think that should be called Christian flowers instead of Arlene's flowers?
I think she can call it whatever she wants. It's her business. I mean, she is.
Is it a Christian floral place?
I mean, she is a Christian who runs a business.
Right, but I'm saying, but is the business a Christian floral business?
They don't specifically cater only to churches.
It seems like that would make a difference then.
I don't think so. My view of this, and this is where my libertarianism really crosses lines, I don't think that this is actually a religious freedom issue. I think this is a basic freedom of association issue. Meaning, I think that if you don't want to have me, I'm a Jew. If you don't want to have Jews at your cafe, I don't really have a problem with that, other than I think you're a jerk.
I have a problem with that.
Right.
Yeah, if you don't want to have Jews at your cafe, I have a huge problem with that.
I mean, I have a problem with it in the sense that I will boycott you.
But I think America...
But I'm not going to use the government to come after you.
But okay, we have a fundamental difference in this.
For sure.
Without the government, there is no civil rights for blacks. There is none.
That without the government, there is no. Without the government,
none.
There is no legal. There is no legal segregation. What I mean by that is that Jim Crow was legally enforced by the government. Okay, it was not just private people who were engaged in segregation because they were racist.
Why do you think Jim Crow happened?
Jim Crow happened because people who were racist voted for Jim Crow.
They already had these opinions.
Okay, well, they can have listen. You can have your opinion. There are lots of people I disagree with who are entitled to their opinions.
But the government without a government remedy for these things, blacks have no remedy in society. Government has to intervene in this.
I don't think that's correct, and I think that the history of the United States shows that's not correct. Meaning that as soon as
what is the 14th Amendment?
Now, I'm not talking about the Civil War. I'm talking beyond the Civil War. So obviously, the government needs to step in to prevent loss of life, liberty, and property. Right. So the fact is that when the government fights a war to end slavery, that's not quite what we're talking about. Now we're talking about Jim Crow, right? I mean, we're talking about.
We're talking about the government needing to intervene,
right,
to protect certain rights or whatever.
So I don't think you have a right to my services. Period.
Okay, so we're talking. It started.
So when you say president, no, but this is
no. But here's what it started with. And when you say libertarian, I know that means certain things. But I have a problem if you have a cafe and you say Jews cannot come in here. That's what you said.
Right.
I said I have a problem with that, and I don't mind government intervening in that.
Right. And I have a problem with it, and I don't want government. I have a problem with it. I don't want government intervening.
What is the remedy? Why do we live in this country if government can't intervene in certain things like
because
that?
I can start a cafe across the street that puts that guy out of business.
Yeah, but Ben, here's my point. That argument could have been used in civil rights and was used. Why do blacks have to sit at the lunch counter? But they're still being served.
No, but this was not the argument that was used in the civil rights movement because it was legally enforced, meaning it was illegal for blacks and whites to sit together in Alabama. A restaurant could be closed down if blacks and whites sat together in Alabama. The federal government, had not only the right, the obligation to step in and tell states that they were not allowed to legally enforce segregation. But I don't think that the federal government or any government really has the role in telling me what I can and cannot do in my business. Well,
you just said that they did.
No, I said that the government cannot tell me what to do. And
but they just did. With if they're ending segregation, they are telling you what to do.
No. I'm talking about the government compelled segregation.
Right.
Jim Crow was compulsory.
I understand. But if the government says there's desegregation, they are telling you now have to do that.
They're saying that no. When the federal government this is the difference between the various titles of the Civil Rights Act. The specific injunction in all of the titles except for, I believe, Title VII, deals with the state governments, meaning the federal government says to the state government, you can no longer prohibit a restaurant from desegregating.
They just told the restaurant what to do.
No, that's not right. They told the government, they told the restaurant that the restaurant can now do whatever it wants. Before, they were telling the restaurant...
Wait. Are they telling the restaurant it could do whatever it wants?
I mean, without Provision 7, without Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act,
So if the restaurant says, we don't want to serve blacks, could they do that?
So, in my opinion, the answer is yes.
But you just said that they can't do that.
No. Okay, so let's take this again. So what I'm saying is that you have a situation in which the government of the state of Alabama took an otherwise non-racist restaurant owner and said to them, you must segregate your restaurants. This is what Jim Crow said.
Non-racist is a big leap. For someone
I'm using a hypothetical here. So there were.
I have to say I disagree with your premise here.
Okay, but it's not actually. I mean, the Woolworth boycott is a good example of non-governmental methods being used to desegregate Woolworths. Right? There was no federal legislation that desegregated Woolworths. Black civil rights activists went into Woolworths and they occupied the counters. And the media coverage was so bad when Woolworths tried to eject them that Woolworths desegregated across the country.
Why did we have to keep doing that?
Why did you have to keep doing what?
Why do we have to? So you're saying if blacks would only keep doing that for every business in America, that could have been a remedy rather than the government stepping in.
I'm saying
like
that
could have been a remedy.
There was a government stepping in that was necessary, but with regard to laws that were on the books,
you got to get to Target, you got to get to Sears now, you got to get to Macy's.
I mean,
come on, black people, you got to desegregate these things.
So a couple of things. One, in today's world, my answer is basically yes. And the reason that my answer is basically yes is because I do not want the government stepping in and telling people what they can do and what they can't do.
Okay, so let me ask you this.
So
I believe that
in the time, now the second part of my answer before I get in the time,
but isn't the pro-life
maybe there's a temporary necessity for the government to step in.
But isn't the pro-life
I would have voted for the Civil Rights Act, in other words.
Okay, but isn't the pro-life position asking the government to step in and protect a life?
Yes. So if somebody threatens your life,
why can't we just go to doctors individually and say, "Hey, man, come on, don't do that"?
Because the government does have a role. If the restaurant were murdering people, the government has a role.
What about the liberty of the woman?
There's a difference between the provision of a service and the murder of a human.
What about the liberty of the woman?
That doesn't come into play if you're talking about the protection of somebody else, meaning that the entire premise of the pro-life movement is that the issue is not the woman. The issue is the child inside the woman.
Okay, so we're talking about people who...
Right, if you walk into a restaurant and somebody tries to kill you, the government should step in and stop it. If you walk into a restaurant and say, "I need you to serve me today," and the restaurant says no, I don't think that the government has a role there.
So the government has a role in some things, but not in others. But
in specifically very clearly defined circumstances, meaning the protection of life, liberty, and property. You have the government protects your rights. What I started this conversation with is you do not have a right to my services, and I don't have a right to your services. So when we're talking about restaurants, that's a service. When we're talking about Arlene's Flowers, that's a service.
Yes, but what I was getting to is the nature of your refusal of service. So the nature of the refusal of service, I think, is very important. You brought up the fact that if they don't want to serve me because I'm a Jew, and I said, I have a problem with that. I don't have a problem if they don't want to serve you because you're not wearing shoes. I don't have a problem with that. That's fine. We have the right to refuse service, blah, 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 blah. I get that. You're trying to run a business. You got certain rules. That discriminates on something that we wouldn't find, unreasonable, let's say. Like the reason why we have words like even unreasonable and those sorts of things is we know not everything fits every rule, right? I believe denying service because you're a Jew is a problem, and I believe that the government should have a say in an issue like that. So I think we have a fundamental disagreement on that.
We do, because I believe that it is a problem, but I don't believe that every problem has a government solution.
Not every problem. I'm talking about this problem.
I don't think this problem.
If I don't want to serve you because you're a Jew, I think that's a problem.
I think it's a problem.
Yeah.
I think that there is a government solution to it, but the government solution is so broad that it grants a power to the government that I do not think is appropriate.
Yeah, and I think stepping in on that is necessary.
And so I'll tell you why.
But that's okay.
But this is no. So my view of government, and this is it's a difference even between many conservatives and sort of libertarians where I am, is that any power you grant to the government, you have to think what that power looks like when somebody who you don't like holds that power.
Slippery slope argument.
It's not a slippery slope argument. It's the power can be used against anybody argument. So, for example, there are a bunch of people on the right now who are interested in regulating the tech companies. They think that the tech companies should be treated as a public utility.
Sure.
I think that that's a mistake because I think that people I don't like could use that power in a way that I don't like.
I understand. There are always unintended consequences to almost anything. But I think the good of an action sometimes outweighs what might be the predicted future of something. Because sometimes you have to deal with what's right in front of you in the moment.
So I agree with that.
Like as you say,
I agree.
I could make, I don't have these arguments, but someone could make arguments about like against pro-life with the government stepping in. I'm not saying I have those arguments, but someone could make the unintended consequences of protecting that right for whatever reasons, And there are many arguments, but I think if you're doing a specific action for a specific good, that should be the primary concern and not what the the future telling argument is, there is I'm not saying there isn't merit to saying.
If you want to set up something with a sunset provision, I'm a lot more warm to it. Meaning that
I'm not mad at sunset provisions for certain things,
right? Because
but there are certain things that are messier than one thing can do for it. Like, and I acknowledge this. I don't believe that legislation cures things. I believe it starts us on a journey of something many times. Like when I think about civil rights legislation and that sort of thing, racism doesn't end because you have civil rights legislation, but at least slaps the hand, you can't do that,
Right.
So hopefully we can get to this place, and that sort of thing, So that's where I believe the government has a role in at least doing that.
Right.
That's where I would differ from classic libertarians, because I think libertarians are so against government doing almost anything. I'm not saying you're that, but when I listen to
I am. I want the government
I really don't
everything.
understand that, because I know that there's this feeling, and Reagan kind of presented this a lot too, that most of the things that government does is bad, which, okay, whatever. I think government can do good things and it can do bad things. And, by its nature, it tends to do things poorly many times, which I understand, But government is the people, too. The people do determine what a lot of these things are as well.
Right. But
in our society.
Right. But I do agree with the founders that, because we're not a pure democracy and we shouldn't be a pure democracy, that the people are very often wrong about things, and segregation in the South would be a perfect example of that. These things were enshrined in law.
Yes, the people as a mass, but the people are also in the republic, that's made up of people as well.
So I like the people having individual rights specifically because I trust people more as individuals than I do people as a collective.
I have it both ways. I have to be honest with you. I think there are things that individually we can figure out, but the reason why I disagree with you, and I'm not sure if that statement makes sense based on some of the things you're saying, communities are very important to the health of societies.
I agree.
And the things that we agree upon with communities are very important.
I don't think government's a community.
Absolutely, communities get it wrong. I'm not saying government is community, but I said government is the people. So the people make up these communities, And I'm talking about the United States. And what I think has been good about some of these things have been a lot of community organizations, things that happen in the community. I think our communities are the strongest part of what can make this country great and what happens at the community level. I really believe that more than the federal and even the state level.
Here's where we totally agree.
Like local government to me is the most under talked about important aspect of healthy societies, let's say.
I totally agree with this. And that's why I think that the loss of localism is a real disaster for the country.
I do think the left does go far in its federal cures for things. I do have a sense of that too.
Right. And this is why, what I was going to say with regard to sort of the great migration from the south to the north is a good example of what happens when folks can finally leave areas that suck and move to areas that treat them better, right? I mean, Detroit becomes a largely black city because black Southerners are looking at this going, why the... Well, of course, but those issues were nothing comparable to the issues of the South, obviously. So, I mean, that's why LA became, heavily black. I mean, people were moving out to places with more opportunity.
Absolutely.
So, freedom tends to be a better solution than government cram downs on a broad level. Now, there may be temporary necessity for those cram downs, which is why I say I would vote for the Civil Rights Act in the time. Do I think that the general principle the government should cram down on people how they handle their business is something I'm comfortable with? No, and I don't think anybody should, frankly, be comfortable with that because it's all fun and games until they decide that,
Sure. I think
you have to cater to
anything the government does can get out of hand in certain ways, but I do think that there definitely are interventions that are necessary depending on what it is. I tend to look at it specifically, and I understand that
on a local level, by the way, I tend to agree with you more, meaning that why? Because you live in an area where you probably know more of the people.
Correct.
Right? You where you share more
even
of
things like zoning and those sorts of things.
You know more of those people. You deal with those people. And that's more of a community than once you get to the federal level. So local government having more power than the federal government, I mean, that is a classical conservative position, obviously. And that's something that the founders really did envision. Local government was responsible for virtually everything. The feds were responsible for very little.
Ben, thank you so much for being here. A couple other questions, because I know religion is a big part of your life and that sort of thing. We talked a little bit about it in politics, but let me ask you a more philosophical question. What do you think is more important to human beings? Do you think the fact of a God or the experience of religion and its activities?
On a day-to-day level, I would say religion and its activities, kind of the social value of religion. On a civilizational level, I think that the belief that there is a creator such that we are created in his image and have innate value is of chief importance.
Yeah, you talk about in your book the importance of, as a human being, needing to know that you have value that is intrinsic to something outside of yourself, given to you by a creator, that sort of thing. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, and that's right.
But I think it's at the root of what your point of view is in terms of the moral purpose part of your book. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, that is fair. And the case that I make is that you can be an atheist and still hold a lot of those same values, but you can't really explain the values, meaning that scientific materialism...
Do you have to explain it if you're living it, though?
You don't have to. I mean, you can live with a certain level of, I'm just not going to go beyond this point. These are core assumptions that I'm making.
Sure.
I think the problem that I have very often is when people say it's not a core assumption, it's a self-evident reality. And I say, well, it's not really a self-evident reality. Like, you can make the same assumptions that my religion makes, where I say that, you know, God said that we ought to do X, and you say, well, I agree we ought to do X, I just don't think God did it. All right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
But
some people are like, I find God just real bossy sometimes. You know?
Well, yeah. I mean, God is bossy, right? I mean, in my religion,
bossy,
he's specifically
sassy.
bossy.
He tends to smote a lot, especially in that Old Testament.
Oh, yeah. And it was good times. A lot of
does
smiting.
God still smote, do you think? Does that still go on? Or is that just more of an Old Testament thing?
Okay, so I think...
Because this whole smoting thing I had a problem with.
Okay, so I think that reality is basically God's rules for the universe. And I think that reality tends to hit you hard, bro, in the words of a famous YouTube video. Okay, so here is my narrative of the past couple of decades in sort of American politics. Oh, yeah. So,
wow.
Here, you ready for this?
There's modern day smoting.
Okay, so here's my narrative. So I think that in 2016, Hillary Clinton spent her entire life wanting to be president. You ready for this? Wait for this.
Oh my God.
You're going to like it, I think, in the end. So
I want it to end on a good note. Okay,
no, you'll like it, I think. So Hillary Clinton spent her entire life desperate to be president, really, really wants to be president of the United States.
I don't know if I would agree with desperate, but I know that's how the right views Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, for sure. That's how we view it.
I think she had the ambitions of a man, but was criticized because she was a woman.
That's fair.
Yeah,
that's fair. But she has the ambitions of the most ambitious men. I mean, she's a very...
Which I have no problem with.
Listen, she can be as ambitious as she wants to be. That's fine.
Right.
But men who want to do it are also desperate to be president, right? I think that Joe Biden is desperate to be president, which is why he's running for the 9th consecutive time. So in any case, and I think Mitt Romney was desperate to be president. He ran multiple times. John McCain really wanted to be president.
Sure.
Okay, this is not a political thing. So Hillary Clinton really, really wants to be president of the United States. And she spends her entire life building up a pretty sterling resume in terms of Secretary of State. She's a senator. She does all of these things. She considers herself
a lot of things that aren't in the public eye that she's done too.
Sure.
Right?
And she spends a lot of time doing this. And then because she's so overweeningly desperate for the position, and she couldn't answer the simple question, why do you want to be president, other than you want to be president, right? This really was, I think, what hurt her, is that if you can look at a candidate, and if you can't answer the sort of Ted Kennedy question, why do you want this?
Sure.
Then you're in trouble. And she ends up being defeated by this charlatan boob who is, kind of a ridiculous human being.
At least we agree on that.
Yeah, and she's defeated by that. So that is a certain level of cosmic of sin being punished on a cosmic level. Then what comes for Donald Trump, I don't know. I fear that it will not be great for Donald Trump, meaning that he spends his entire life wanting to be loved, desperate to be loved, interested in attention, wants to be the center of attention. Where this goes from here, if pattern holds, may not be wonderful for him. I think that people tend to get what they deserve in this life is my general viewpoint. Not always,
sometimes,
but I think...
Bad guys sometimes win, though, unfortunately.
Unless you're a dictator of a small, Southeast Asian country. I think typically...
I'm in showbiz, so I've seen bad guys win a lot.
That is true. Although cosmic justice came for Harvey Weinstein, right? So I tend to believe that what goes around comes around to a certain extent.
Yeah, I will say,
there's where I see the hand of God
Hillary
in this
Clinton's defense, I don't think she was smote, or smoting.
She certainly, has treated it like that.
Let me tell you who did the smoting was Benghazi. Fox News every night for like 5 years.
She lost because she lost because nobody showed up to vote for her.
Republicans hated Hillary Clinton. I remember in the early 90s they were ridiculing her.
She was pushing nationalized healthcare in like 1993.
Yes.
That's why Republicans disliked her. Okay,
no, they disliked her even before she did that.
Well, they disliked her when she was doing the "I'm not Tammy Wynette."
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they came out against her.
Yeah.
All right, Ben. The book is The Right Side of History. The book is real fascinating. There are parts. It's kind of interesting. Ben, as you could tell, he's a big philosophy student. I mean, your allusions to philosophy are makes my head explode in there. I mean,
it's a quick tour.
Yes, I'm familiar with maybe half of some of the names too, but I get where you're coming from. But it is an interesting argument that you make, remember where you came from, is this where we're going, and that sort of thing, and take from it what you will, in terms of the agreement. But well done.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thanks for being.
Thanks for the conversation, dude. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It really is a blast.
I believe, and Ben, we talked about this. We need to have more conversations. They don't have to be divisive. Ben and I could sit down here and we could have an attack conversation and go after each other, and that might make a lot of people happy. But in this political season, I feel like let's have a little something different. Well, I appreciate you coming on.
And back at you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot.